Wonderful. Okay, so everyone should get a warning that we are now recording. Okay, so we came up with a beautifully snappy title, which we will probably revise as we go on. I'm thinking of this project as being Outdoor Culture and Heritage Capital, in short, but the idea is for us to understand the value, particularly with respect to decision makers, and that covers both for social cost benefit analysis and for accounting. So we're thinking very much about Green Book standard methodologies and evidence building. The project team includes myself. I'm Amy Binner. I'm an environmental economist at the University of Exeter. Perhaps we should all introduce ourselves, if that's okay. Yeah, sorry.
And hello, that's a lot of feedback. Hello, I'm Tom Dommett. I'm the Head of Historic Environment for the National Trust.
I am Hannah Fluck, Senior National Archaeologist, National Trust.
I'm Ethan Addicott, lecturer at the University of Exeter, environmental economist.
Lawrence Shaw, lead historic environment advisor for Forestry England.
Ian?
Hello everyone, I'm Ian Bateman from University of Exeter, and my background is in economics and the environment. Thank you.
I don't think that Ingrid is on the call today, so we also have Ingrid Samuel from National Trust, and one person who's missing from this lineup because I couldn't find her picture online is Rebecca Clark, also at the National Trust. And so we have an interdisciplinary project team covering historic environment, GIS methods, digital assets, archaeology, accounting, and valuation methods. We are very lucky to be working with a wide range of partners. Many of you have joined us for the kickoff today. I've just stuck everyone's logos here so that you can see the range of partners that we are working with and who we hope to involve in each part of the project. What's the key goal? Well, the idea is to address the practical problems for undertaking robust cost-benefit analysis and adapting accounting principles for sustainable management of culture and heritage capital. How are we going to do that? Well, we came up with quite an ambitious set of objectives. First, looking at the taxonomy of values and trying to understand how and why people engage with culture and heritage assets, and how we can classify these in a way that enables us to use valuation methods to separate and understand how those values are interlinked, and how we can put monetary values on them. Then mapping out baselines. So we want to collate information on the historic environment, but also environmental data en masse. I'm going to talk about these in a minute in more detail, so I should probably be quiet. Then the third objective was looking at valuation methods and accounting, and the fourth was wrapping that into specific case studies and producing reports and guidance for practical application. So the taxonomy is really using the DCMS culture and heritage capital as a starting point. But we want to think about this specifically in the context of outdoor culture and heritage, thinking about why people value it, what are the stocks and flows that people get, and who are the beneficiaries. So mapping this out and thinking about useful taxonomies and classifications that then feed into valuation approaches. Along with that taxonomy, we need to think in tandem about sector needs and how these should be prioritized so that we can allocate our resources to go for the highest impact and most pressing of the sector needs. And that's why having so many sector partners is really important to us with the project. The baseline, I think I've already said this, so mapping environmental data and historic environment, but specifically to understand how this overlaps with natural capital and help us to try and disentangle but also understand the complementarities between culture and heritage capital and natural capital. This is also key for us in terms of informing benefit transfers. So we want to be going for high levels of detailed GIS information that allow us to understand the context for our case studies and how these can be applied, or where the limitations are in applying these to other contexts. in our objective 3, we're really thinking about methodologies, and this is where Ethan and I had a lot of fun coming up with new ideas. So we want to relate this to our taxonomy and use this to develop experiments, working with National Trust and Forestry England and their huge estates to come up with some nice experiments that allow us to tap into whether it's possible to separate values. We were thinking about this in terms of the relationship between natural and cultural capital, but also the relationship between physical and digital assets. So as this evolves, we'll try and come up with some cool experimental designs that allow us to tap into this. And then the outputs from that will feed into social cost benefit analysis, but also into developing culture and heritage capital accounts and decision support tools. And finally, these will be applied. So we're taking theoretical work, applying the experiments in case study regions, working with stakeholders, having sector workshops to understand the wider context and make sure that we're actually using knowledge that's already embedded in the sector about what these values are and what we need to be considering, and then transferring that. So we'll try and have a whole bunch of engagement activities that allow us to iterate through, revise, and then produce practical reports. Okay, so that's me done talking about the overview of the project, but are there any questions before we move on to the disciplinary talks just on the project itself? No. Okay, great. So first I'm going to pass over. Oh, yes. Hi, Anna.
Hi, I was just wondering what the time frame is. You may have said, but just wondering how
Yes.
long it was going to
So
last altogether.
Yeah, we're funded over 29 months, which you can probably tell was related to the amount of funding we could bid for. So yeah, we're looking at 2.5 years as an initial run.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, Patricia?
Yeah, the taxonomy is something that DCMS has been working on, commissioning some research to Ipsos. Have cooperated to that, and there is a big project led by Historic England. So how are you overlapping this? If you can,
Yes.
clarify, because
question.
the taxonomy, what we have been doing in this contracted research is, and what I've been arguing for some time, is to develop a sort of ecosystem service approach for cultural heritage. In terms of natural capital, obviously, you are all a great expert about that, and there is. When we transfer to cultural assets, then things become slightly more complicated. Your case is perfect because overlaps, and we need to understand probably what exactly you define by outdoor cultural heritage, because the definition is also important. And then, the question I raised before, to what extent this taxonomy might overlaps, develops new things. So if you can, yeah.
I'm speaking a little out of turn because we're very early in the project, but in the talk that I'm doing, I'll present my thinking and our thinking so far on how we might start using the natural capital framework to move towards a culture and heritage framework, based on the work that's come out of DCMS already as well. But I think the key for us is to try and work with projects that are already underway to develop a common framework. Right? It's not about developing something different or that's competing. It's about taking what's been done in other projects, seeing whether it fits into the work that we have and the case studies that we have, and also adding anything that we find that's missing as a gap. So it's really a sort of theoretical exploration and application of work from other projects, and then a feeding back on how we might improve that or where we find that there are limitations. I hope that answers.
Yeah,
It's
also
worth saying. Right, we've got that sound. Adala Leeson was invited to say they're unable to attend, so we have got good connections there. I used to work quite closely with the Dala Leeson when I was working at Historic England. So we have it's just unfortunately she can't be here today to give us her side of how we would fit in with that particular research project through this programme.
So I think maybe for those of us in the room, we'll keep your mics off so that we only use one because it's picking up. Thank you for the chat.
Has that feedback improved with the
Yeah.
with the change? Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Okay. Right. So without further ado, we shall move on to our introductory talks. I'll stop sharing it.
Okay. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, that's good.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. And I've got quite a short presentation to sort of almost set a bit of a baseline, a foundation of where perhaps both the National Trust and Forestry England are coming from with regards to our outdoor culture and heritage, and hopefully lay some groundwork to understand how the work we're going to develop over the next couple of years is going to be implemented across our sites and feed into our management. So to give you some context on the two organisations as a whole, we've got nearly 14,000 holdings across England, Wales and Northern Ireland, which equates to nearly well over 5,000 square kilometres. And Forestry England have a stat when we say 99% of people in England live within an hour's drive of our site. I think by combining National Trust holdings, we've suddenly taken that probably to 100%, and it's probably a shorter journey time as well. So what we have is incredible estates, land holdings, which vary from heathland to forest to upland grazed areas, to upland, in either in the Lake District or even in the South Downs, but a hugely varied estate with lots of things going on and very accessible to the general public. Within that estate, we've got a very rich and very culture and heritage, and that varies from nationally designated monuments such as scheduled monuments, with a substantial number of those, listed buildings, registered parks and gardens, and close to 200,000 known sites and monuments. So these are non-designated features, and this is sort of close to what we're touching on in terms of outdoor heritage, but these are lumps and bumps and things that are hidden away in our natural landscapes in inverted commas. But we have incredible cultural landscapes from the Forest of Dean and the New Forest. We also, our land is found in each and every national park in Great Britain, as I understand it. We have World Heritage sites we have sites within World Heritage sites, and the heritage varies from built to above and below ground archaeology, lumps and bumps, as I mentioned. But we also have heritage attached to our organisational histories as well. The National Trust has got a deep history in its creation, and the Forestry Commission as a result of the First World War. But generally, our historical environment can often be seen as a constraint to a number of the things that our organisations want to deliver we have broad-reaching aims and ambitions. And when we think about our historic environment and those constraints and the considerations that we have, there are a whole host of influencing factors, whether it's the protocol for the care of the government's historic estate, and from Forestry England's perspective, the UK Forestry Standard and UK Woodland Insurance Standards, things like heritage at risk, scheduled monument management, and then internal things such as climate policies. And I've pinched that right side of my slide from Tom's presentation Tom's done previously. I don't know if you want to cover any of that, Tom.
Yeah, this is just a piece from our theory of change that sits within our Managing Land for People and Nature programmes. That's our big programme of landscape change driven by the nature and climate crisis, and just reflecting the attempts to really integrate outcomes for cultural heritage within that, whether that's from the kind of the very local and site-based level right through to our aspirations, you know, beyond our boundaries in terms of genuinely inspiring people to connect with and care for heritage and nature. So really trying to bring those things together.
So a whole host of things influencing our approach to management of our historic environments, from national policy to internal policy to legal obligations and a whole host of other things. And often we find, the historic environment can come bottom of the run at times. We also, both organisations, I think, suffer from common perceptions of what we are and what we represent, and pressures to our historic environment. So whether that's nice green tea, or it's just trees and cutting down trees, we have wildlife introduction, we have wildlife management, we have recreation considerations, and we have climate emergency impacts and the roles that our landscapes will play in combating those changes that we see at times of tree planting and other things. And all of it has to be informed by data and evidence. So we have huge amounts of data for our historic environment records across the country. We are commissioning work constantly, surveys, landscape risk assessments, even archaeological investigations to help improve our understanding about the historic environments that we house and we manage. And we want to go above and beyond just green lines and lumps and polygons on maps to really pull out that, so understand what those features are, understand the thematic attributes to them, so they're more than just an Iron Age site with there are more tree and or they are burial or whatever the case may be, but they're above ground, below ground, built, and really understand what the patterns and themes are going across our estates to inform our management decisions. And general management might vary from scrub management, working with volunteers to clear work or commissioning work to be undertaken, to the maintenance of ruined structures such as the one there on the left of the slides. And all of that is to ensure that these sites are maintained and live on to the future, but also the sites themselves might provide other benefits such as ecological benefits or social benefits. And it's not just general management, we also have things such as natural influences down there, Zenadale in the Lake Districts. We have the only unmanaged watercourse in Britain, which is actively destroying scheduled monuments. We have public footpaths and cycle paths impacting scheduled monuments, and we have poaching taking place on archaeological sites from livestock, such as the one in the top there in the middle. And with all of this, we've also got large landscape scale changes taking place, whether that's wetland restorations, whether that's peatland restorations, or large scale tree planting revisions to fit with a whole host of things from nature emergency and climate change impacts. We also clearly like to use our historic environment in our offers to feed into education, well-being, recreation. We name cycle trails after historic characters. We allow people to engage with the Romans whilst they're going to the loo in our site in the bottom left corner there. And they can interact with digital stuff, they can interact with artwork that's been inspired by our cultural heritage and our historic environment, and we have interpretation and whatnot. But really, and this is a very crude and rather arbitrary slide at the end, but it's about understanding the role that the historic environment has within a whole host of different influencing factors. And this is Zenadale again in the Lake Districts. And we have things from the value of the trees and the impacts of the trees and what that they bring from cold hard cash to carbon sequestration, carbon capture, and then the difference between planting trees and natural regeneration, the value of having unmanaged watercourses to the natural environment, and the impact that all of these have on the known archaeological record, the historical environment, the culture, and the heritage. these trees and these landscapes also offer a setting, a cultural and heritage setting in which these archaeological sites and monuments sit. And as we look to change our landscapes, there's a consideration there as to what the benefit, what takes priority. And then other things like infrastructure, like roads, like interpretation, access and well-being. But really, that's just a very rough and crude image of all the things we need to consider with regards to livestock environment and our leadership.
Thank you very much. So I think we'll pause for questions between each talk in case people have immediate questions. Maybe. Okay. Otherwise, we will move on to the next talk, which is Ian just put his hand up. Oh, yeah.
It's a bit late, but you know the sort of data that Lawrence was just showing. Is that something that you might be able to think about relating to through the applied work?
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah, and so that's part of the baselining plan initially, to look at what historic records and GIS information is held as assets within each of the organisations, but also broader than that. So we'll look at publicly available sources as well, and that will inform the case study choice, as well as the application and looking at benefit transfer possibilities.
Wonderful, that's great.
Any further questions? Okay.
Great. Are the slides showing?
Yeah, Ethan and I don't get the slides and the Wi-Fi.
Right. Okay, that's useful. I won't look at that. In which case, I will assume the slides are up and working for everyone. Yeah, hello everyone. I'm going to echo and build on a lot of what Lawrence has talked about, actually, which is right. Brockman is the reason that we're both really invested in this research. A little bit of background just on the National Trust, and maybe some slightly different figures, so we'll get to the more familiar ones. But we are absolutely an organisation that is built around promoting the preservation and conservation for the benefit of the nation of land of historic interest and natural beauty, and we are absolutely an organisation working at scale. We are the biggest conservation charity in Europe. We have around 500 pay for entry places, and many more places that are outside of our pay boundary, with about 20 million visits a year, and of course 7 million members to date. Got 1 million collection items, 2 million scones every year. Thank you if you are part of that number. You're not just a statistic, but it helps. And we own 56 entire villages, 39 pubs and inns. We've got an incredibly diverse estate. And while we may sometimes be thought of as the sort of country house organisation, actually we are a landscape organisation. That is what we are at our heart. It's what makes the National Trust special. It's where our first ever acquisition came from. And we're now about 250,000 hectares of land, 780 miles of coast, 60,000 hectares of SSSI within that, the nation's largest farmer. So, actually the management of most of our land is not through us necessarily, but through our tenant farmers. And so working with stakeholders like that is incredibly important, and communicating effectively with stakeholders like that is really important. And that's part of the reason for this work, to help us do that. Places at 9 World Heritage Sites, and all those big numbers about records of archaeological sites and registered parks and gardens and scheduled monuments. And just, I suppose, to set out our sort of philosophy around cultural heritage in the Trust. And the quote on the right-hand side is from the chair of the National Trust, Renee Olivieri. One of our core beliefs is the lives of the people who came before us matter to us. And we make decisions based on our understanding of the long view of history and our place in it. Respect for future generations goes hand in hand with respect for the planet and respect for the past. And it's really about trying to take that holistic view that recognises the history of our places is the foundation for their future. So we believe that cultural heritage isn't just about the past, it's about the future. Our role is to respect and grow that cultural inheritance and tell those stories and share those stories and add new significances. And key to that is making our cultural heritage relevant and purposeful now and realising its potential to deliver public benefit. And so it would be useful to have a way of measuring that, I suppose. And we know the historic environment supports individual well-being, that it fosters communities of place and interest and practice, and that it makes huge contributions as well to nature recovery and climate action. And there are various bits of research out there that will attest to that, from working with visitors, from looking at contribution to the economy, from surveys around well-being. So we know that there is a huge value there that we sometimes struggle to articulate, and understanding the value of the contribution that's being made and fundamentally how we can increase that value needs to be a really important part of our decision making. And in terms of the wider National Trust strategy as a whole, what we're doing as an organisation, I picked out some of the key drivers for our work, and whether that's involving more people in actively improving our places and collections, increasing our visitor numbers through history and culture, ensuring our places can adapt to the impacts of climate change, restoring habitats and carbon sequestration, and engagement opportunities. And our aim really is to ensure that the historic environment and our cultural heritage is making genuinely the contributions that it can and should be making to those things. And of course that strategy is responding to some incredible pressures on our places, and whether that is the impacts of climate change and our responses to climate change, whether it's the crisis in nature, whether it's the loneliness epidemic, the disconnect between people and landscape and places that we see. All of these are prompting really challenging decisions that need to be taken in the round about how our landscapes and the cultural heritage which defines them is going to change. And that's a really key part as well. The decisions are really being made by land managers rather than individual subject specialists. And so ensuring that those land managers have the right information, consistent information that they can bring together to take an holistic view is really important. And so just to touch on a couple of those kind of key areas really where we are making those decisions and where we need that evidence base to make good decisions. So in respect of nature recovery and cultural heritage, there's the issue of actually firstly just recognising the contribution that cultural heritage makes to the natural environment, and whether that's the incredible overlaps that occur between scheduled ancient monuments and SSI areas, or whether it's acknowledging the importance of hill forts as habitats as key habitats for butterflies and calcareous grassland, or thinking kind of more widely about outdoors cultural heritage as things like hedgerows, for instance. And actually the image that you can see in the sort of top left there comes from some research that we've done as part of our Blossom campaign, and was using artificial intelligence to extract historic boundary features from historic mapping. And that kind of feeds into that next point as well around cultural heritage and defining some of the opportunities for positive landscape change for people and nature, in this case, identifying thousands of kilometres of lost hedgerows and boundary features that could become targets for restoration. And of course, many of those lost features still represented by tangible remains of cultural heritage, where that's perhaps in the form of shallow and slight earthworks where those boundary features once were. And of course, also looking at how we manage the impact of cultural heritage from the delivery of some of this big landscape change that Lawrence touched on. Woodland creation, wetland creation, and the images that you can see in the bottom right come from the Holmcroft estate in Somerset, where we've reintroduced some beavers, and in this case, we've reintroduced them into a set of historic mill ponds. So that cultural heritage is actually the foundation for species reintroduction and habitat creation. And really interesting discussions there about the impact of those beavers on that cultural heritage, both potentially difficult in terms of the management and degradation of the stonework and infrastructure around those mill ponds, but also incredibly positive, for instance, in reintroducing water into a feature which was designed to hold water, and so thereby making it much more legible and much more significant as an asset than there was before. There are those issues around climate adaptation, and the Trust has been working with a number of partners producing our climate hazard maps and looking at the exposure and vulnerability of a whole suite of our assets, including cultural heritage, to a changing climate and those hazards of increased rainfall and storminess and erosion and shrink heave and all of the rest. And so understanding again the value of our cultural heritage and how that value changes depending on our treatment of it is really important. Thinking about adaptation pathways for cultural heritage and the thresholds for changing our management approach to cultural heritage sites, right from the kind of preventative management and maintenance all the way through to ideas around adaptive release and the change and transformation of sites and what that means for their value. And of course, considering cultural heritage within wider climate adaptation schemes. So, for instance, flood remediation and water management is a huge one up in on the River Skell in the north, which runs through Fountains Abbey and Studley Royal World Heritage Site. Actually, one of the driving impetus for a lot of work on that catchment is about the impact of floodwaters on the homes downstream. But there is, of course, huge implications for the cultural heritage of the World Heritage Site as part of that. And Lawrence touched as well on those issues around engagement, experiences, and interpretation. And here it becomes really about how we can prioritise most effectively. There are lots of places where we can invest in interpretation in different forms, whether that's off-site digital, on-site digital, paths and trails, physical access, intellectual access through interpretation, new experiences, programming, and actually understanding the contribution of those things, the impact in different circumstances and through different approaches is a really fundamental piece of understanding that we need in order to direct investments to where they are going to realise the biggest benefits. And finally, there is a really important piece around the contribution that our cultural heritage makes at a landscape scale. and moving from an individual site focus to a landscape scale of focus. So the first image that you can see at the top is from Castlefield Viaduct, an incredible piece of industrial heritage, which we've been working to bring back to life and create new access to, and create a sort of sky garden within it, understanding the contribution to that wider community of that work that we're doing, but also just thinking about, for instance, those parts of 9 World Heritage Sites. The image at the bottom comes from the Tin Coast World Heritage Site in Cornwall, of which the National Trust owns a portion, but understanding more effectively how important that portion that we own is, and the impact about the decisions that we make in terms of the management of that portion of that cultural landscape on the wider landscape, and how we can use that understanding to engage local communities, to work more closely with stakeholders, to understand the value of the whole. And so that brings to the end of my piece, really. Hopefully that's just outlined some of the challenges that we see ourselves facing into, and really where it's becoming critical that we have good ways of articulating the value that cultural heritage is bringing to each of those situations, and ways of expressing that really work positively for decision makers, for land managers, to take that holistic, rounded view of the decisions, rather than seeing them in silos, as they so often do at the moment, and which often results, as I've said, in the historic environment being seen as a constraint to be tackled, rather than an opportunity to be realised.
Okay, any questions from? Yes, Anishka?
Yeah, it's less a question, it's more a bit of what's been going through my mind listening to things so far. And I think one thing that strikes me is that there'll be a capital value that is about social and community benefit in the round. So improvements for nature, improvements for carbon sequestration, that benefits all of us. But when we talk about things like well-being and placemaking, how I think the challenge is, but also the opportunity for this project is, how do we make sure that the capital outputs that are proposed or developed aren't just about sort of already engaged, rural facing, middle class beneficiaries? Like, how, given that the cultural heritage and environment sector are amongst the two least most diverse sectors, how can we make sure that when we're developing capital models, it's not just ourselves talking to ourselves in terms of those benefits? So what are the checks and balances that we can put in place in this project? And I think if this project can do that, that's actually really unique, because we're tending to just talk to ourselves constantly. So that was just a thought, and it was mainly because Tom was talking about purposeful. And, when I looked at those sort of 6, so purposeful and relevant, and the 6 strategic outcomes of the National Trust, 3 of them are people focused. So that is about who we're talking to and how we articulate benefits and how we articulate meaning. And I also think that's the key to unlocking funding, because a lot of the funding streams that we might be looking for people focused work in the future is public health, it's placemaking, it's, that's where there's going to be investment to tap into. So that's just some thoughts that have come to mind hearing stuff so far.
It's a crucial point, and it's something that we discussed at length when we were putting together a proposal and trying to sort of think about how we might tackle it. But I don't think there's an easy answer. But I think it's very evident that you need that stakeholder engagement beyond just use at site, right? And that's where we have to begin. But also being aware that it's not just about us articulating values to other people, but really trying to understand from other people what values they already conceive of, and that we might not even be aware some of the types of values that different communities hold. Because, you know, if you look around this whole call, we're not that diverse.
It is. It's that amazing thing that sets cultural heritage apart in a lot of ways, is that all of that significance and value really predominantly emerges from the connection that people create with. It's how people engage with it. And, you know, things don't have an intrinsic meaning. That meaning is created by the participation and engagement that people have with the cultural heritage, and that's amazing and creates huge opportunities. If you're right, if we can listen more to what people experience and how people can develop that connection, but it's also really challenging in terms of measuring it.
Patricia, do you want to come in?
Yes, just a comment also in response to the question that were raised. There is research that is being going on between cultural heritage impact on well-being. Particularly is promoted by one of our partners, ICROM. They are very keen in disentangling the benefits in terms of well-being. So we had a number of workshops in the last few years on these themes. Even during pandemic, there was published the Charter of Rome articulating the fact that has been proven during the first months of pandemic that even access to digital culture, digital heritage, let's say, has impacted positively on mental health. There is also broad research on how tourism impacts, that is cultural tourism or environmental tourism, impacts on mental health and well-being of people. So, I mean, there is in very different disciplines maybe, but there is quite a body of work that should probably be put together to argue this. So we don't start from scratch. The other thing I wanted to say, so it is an important element, especially if you think this is something that we are organizing at ICROM headquarters in the next year. We are trying to look at cultural heritage accounting. So it's something that probably, so how certain index also well-being are created without accounting for culture. If you look at the index of well-being or ACD, it doesn't account for culture. So this is things that some of us have already been raising with some institution. And so it is important that research project, and since we are coordinating our efforts, probably reflect on this and can make also a statement at the end of the project on this element, the importance of a cultural accounting. You know, Scotland has got one of the first well-being accounting for the economy. Let's see how it's done for people who are expert in accounting. New Zealand was the first one. So there are a number of things that we need to connect also in our project. The other comment I wanted to make is related to my question at the beginning. How do you define heritage? The presentation or outdoor heritage, I think, have clearly identified what we call it as cultural landscape, which is a category that has been defined, is important, and in my opinion, is a crucial one because it represents a clear overlap between culture and natural heritage. So it gives, you know, even developing a taxonomy for that, reflecting on benefits and impacts on well-being, is very interesting because the definition of cultural capital by David Crosby is rooted in the definition of natural capital. So this is a good example of heritage that bridges the two capitals, and so the reflection between where the two capitals breaks, if there is any breaking in both in the definition and the implementation of valuation approaches for them, it's really interesting. So I think it's got a lot of potential for bridging the gap between the two disciplines that need culture and environmental economics that need to work hand in hand for this kind of operation and impact on decision making. So there is more that maybe we can discuss also in another occasion, but I think this is a crucial element. Cultural landscape, what we mean by cultural landscape, how we can articulate the benefits through a taxonomy, and how can we value these benefits.
If I can add a comment, so I'm really glad that you think it's worthwhile for a start. But when looking at the existing sort of classification of culture and heritage assets, it felt like cultural landscapes was key to outdoor culture and heritage, but also we have this unavoidable overlap with historic buildings and archaeological deposits that we've also got to somehow grapple with when designing our experiments and choosing the case study sites. So yes, the focus is probably going to be on landscapes. Yeah, but we perhaps have a bit of a overlap with other areas as well, and which is why I think it's really important that we stay engaged across projects. And I don't know if we should move to there are a few comments in the chat as well.
I think I might, if I do my bit, it might help answer some of the things that come up. It's a very nice introduction for this. Thank you to some of the things. So one of the things I was forgot to put in a slide for actually, but is worth flagging given that discussion, is the definitions that we use. And I think where we're working across disciplines, and even quite frankly within what people refer to as the cultural sphere or cultural heritage sphere, there are really very different definitions and understanding of what we mean. So I'm going to present sort of some of the work that I did back in probably starting about 2016. When I was at Historic England, that was drawing on, or sort of trying to find a way through before culture and heritage capital had really become a thing, that relationship with natural capital. But one of the important points to make is that actually there is a distinction between which we are not always clear on ourselves when we talk, especially as archaeologists, when we talk about archaeology or the historic environment and cultural heritage or even heritage, and sometimes those terms can be used interchangeably and they're not interchangeable. So for me, that historic environment element is a really important one, and you'll see in a couple of slides in a moment that physical aspects of human activity over time that manifest themselves within the environment, and that includes everything from buildings to archaeological deposits, the things we can't see, the things we can, and landscapes and cultural landscapes. And then you have the cultural heritage, which is the things that we pass between generations, which also includes the intangible, the practices, the myths, the legends, the music, all of the kind of creativity and some broader cultural context. And archaeology is one of the toolkits, the science by which we can investigate those physical remains, that physical historic environment remains in the past, but is also closely connected to that cultural heritage of how we have that knowledge and information and understanding of things that we pass between generations. So within archaeology, the idea of conserving or preserving these places, which often we can't see, for future generations, is really quite deeply embedded within good archaeological practice and management. So hopefully, I think we're going to have to sort of tease apart some of these definitions, be clear as we progress, but that's sort of where I'm coming from. One of the, I've clicked on the wrong slide rather than one on my screen. That's no good, is it? Right. So one of the things that I've sort of been mulling over the years of the relationship between natural capital and cultural heritage is the kind of the reasons that it really matters, the reason that we can't just put these things in separate buckets and find frameworks that don't talk to each other, is that distinction between nature and culture is a really odd one. It's not one that's universally understood. But it is incredibly embedded in policy and in practice, particularly in the UK, but also elsewhere. And that division, even down to the government departments that address and deal with these different aspects, can be a barrier to the ways in which we are responding to some of those challenges that Tom and Lawrence alluded to, where we need human responses within landscapes and environments which are not entirely natural or entirely cultural. And so understanding that connection is actually really quite fundamental to making good sustainable decisions for the future. But also, and this, I know this is a provocative thing to say, but people-centered solutions. So cultural heritage is about people. I think Anushka's already talked about being aware of what we mean by that and being as inclusive as possible, recognising when we're not thinking about all people, but actually this is about how you can bring those things together and put people in the heart of some of those solutions that we will be developing, hopefully, and evidence through this sort of process. So a few images up there just to show that deep connection, including some research that was led by Historic England at Plymouth University on the relationship between biodiversity history and human activity in the Holocene, the way in which a lot of our communications around the natural environment actually very frequently are drawing on very cultural landscapes, because that is what resonates with us and with people. I've got an extensive collection of Twitter screenshots that emphasise that point. Starting, I sort of wanted to reflect on a number of projects that I was involved with since about 2016. That started with a kind of revision of a piece of work by Historic England that was exploring that relationship between ecosystem services, natural capital and historic environment. So again, remember by the historic environment and very particularly the physical manifestations of human activity within landscape, not talking about cultural heritage holistically. But it identified that there was a need to think very carefully about the relationship between these two things, that at that time we didn't necessarily have much information to really help us do that. And there were opportunities for new approaches that might be able to cater better for recognising the value of historic environment, particularly around identifying and valuing those services that would flow from that. And also the kind of recognising that connection that I was just talking about. So there's also been in the history of thinking about ecosystem services, cultural services element of that has very much tended to focus on the intangible or the immaterial aspects of cultural heritage that flow from the environment, rather than recognising that complexity of the physical. And this diagram here from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment illustrates that. The cultural aspects are all very much focused on things that flow, less tangible things, not recognising the physicality of cultural heritage as the historic environment and its relationship to the environment. So between 2017 and 2019, we commissioned, I think it was 8, so I was trying to remember, I felt like it was 9, and apologies if I've missed one and someone remembers what that is. Short studies, just testing what would happen if we started thinking about the historic environment and the assets within the historic environment in the language of ecosystem services and natural capital. And each of the research projects took quite a different stance, and we learned an awful lot from that process that actually, to be honest, haven't had a chance to really consolidate. So this project will be involved sort of going back and thinking about what we learned from some of that research. So I just thought I'd pick on a couple of them to summarise some of the things that were found. So this one from Blackdown Hills AIMB in I think it's Somerset, Devon border, not a million miles from here, was looking at the ways in which you could use the historic environment record information. So Ian, you mentioned the data that we have access to. So this was using historic landscape character data and historic environment record data to see whether you could recognise when you get a sort of a relationship between the complexity and the history of a landscape and the ecosystem services that are provided. And they felt that they were able to make some of those connections, but really emphasize the importance of recognizing that at a landscape scale, the connection between all those different functions and service flows, which I think was sort of too clunky really to try and to fit within the natural capital framework, which I think is emphasizing why this culture and heritage capital approach is so important and can be so complementary. Hopefully. There was another project that was looking at a marine context, looking at the relationship between underwater heritage assets, in this instance mainly wrecks, and ecosystem services within that context. They noted in particular that need for site scale research and stakeholder engagement. So I think, and again, that's backing up what Anushka and Patricia were saying about that idea of who and how, who is benefit and how do you find that out and who do you ask? But also, again, that point about that network connecting to that wider network of services within a landscape rather than just individual sites, however you might want to define them. There was another piece of work by RPA and land use consultants that was looking at developing a framework based on work that had already been undertaken in the Trent. And this was very much using the historic environment record data and coming up with a process by which you could then identify those assets that might be particularly pertinent to thinking about the services that were flowing from those assets. And also then categorising the relevance so that you could then take that work forward. Then there was also work by Fjorder, and Fjorder looked not just at the contribution from current ecosystem services, but Anthony developed a kind of some pretty funky diagrams to show that idea that we can actually learn from the ecosystem services that were provided by particular assets in the past and how those therefore might be able to inform future decisions, which is something that we've been looking at. The work that Tom showed around the blossom and lost hedgerows. It's very much in that ilk of what we can actually learn in order to suggest future natural capital assets and how those might relate. And then there was work through a sort of consortium through the University of Gloucester, CCRI. They did a number of projects for us. This was the most recent that happened through Historic England, looking at archaeological features in the Lake District National Park. The interesting thing about those archaeological features is that they are not always visible. So this poses that conundrum of what you do with the things that you cannot see. And as archaeologists, I think we're a bit nervous about the idea that you end up focusing on those things that might be most obvious and most legible within our landscape. And how can we value that we can't see? And perhaps we might not want to be revealing because we want to be able to pass that to future generations. And that idea of potential, archaeological potential knowledge, etc., but sort of curating and conserving that within our places. And I think for the National Trust as an organisation that's for everyone forever, that becomes quite a particular challenge in our management decisions. These were the processes that particular project went through, scoring, looking based on the legibility and time depth, condition, function, and the relationship between those different aspects that might be measurable in order to determine the value of those assets. I've also included here in Scotland, there was, I think when we did that initial piece of work in 2016, the closest anyone had really got to sort of pulling cultural heritage into a natural capital approach was in Scotland. But again, you'll see it's very much based on that, the less tangible aspects. And I think that's what's a nice challenge of this about culture and heritage capital assets is thinking about that physicality of those things that we're looking at. Now, this is a diagram that was born out of some early discussions, I think probably around 2018-19, with colleagues at Historic England, when we were before culture and heritage capital had been kind of pinned down in that particular terminology. And this was my attempt to try and think about how a culture heritage capital might relate to natural capital, and thinking more holistically about environmental capital, rather than thinking of things as natural or cultural. What we're actually talking about is things that are physically placed within the world. They have a space, a point in space, on a map, on the ground. That's what I mean by that environmental capital term. I found that quite helpful as a way of sort of moving away from some of the assumptions that lay behind some of the natural capital approaches. Now, some aspects of cultural heritage fit very much within that. Some of them are themselves natural capital assets, hedgerows, woodlands, things like that, both cultural assets and natural assets. But some things are not and sit outside of that. Things like museum collections, objects, some of the less tangible cultural heritage assets. And then the ways in which those services flow from that, I started to think about cultural heritage services in the same way that you might have ecosystem services. And as in ecosystem services, you have the strand for cultural services. Perhaps in cultural heritage services, there's a strand for environmental services, or something along that ilk. It's about as far as we got, I think, that diagram. Gosh, I am now viewing a screen. It's so tiny, I can't remember what I look at. Oh yes, so this is thanks, sorry. So DCMS. Patricia, you mentioned already the work that was looking at the asset structure, the culture and heritage capital assets, and this is the table that came out in 2021, I think. So you've got those different categories there that are recognising that built historic environment, that landscapes, as cultural landscapes, archaeology, collections of movable heritage, portable performance and performance venues, and digital assets. Now, I think for us, when we're talking about the outdoor culture and heritage, and I think we probably still need to, it's probably our task for this afternoon is coming up with that clear definition that we were working to, but it does overlap between, as Amy was saying, between that built historic environment and landscapes and archaeological interests and categories there. And that relationship between those and digital assets for us is also a very, very interesting one. And I've also put this in here just to remind me that there's another strand of work that's actually still ongoing, which Historic England were exploring, and as the Environment Agency, I don't think could join us today, and certainly us at the National Trust are looking at the ways in which we can use that understanding of landscape, historic landscape, the things that make up the characteristics of the landscape that we have today, and what we can understand about past landscapes to suggest affordances for or opportunities for natural capital assets. And for the Environment Agency, this was particularly interesting in relation to flood risk management and carbon sequestration. So that there are a number of reports that have come out of that, and that work and collaboration is ongoing. So I was trying to find a way. I couldn't find a funky picture for this one, so sorry, it's just some words. About how, the reason that it's so difficult to try and unpick or even articulate some of these relationships is that cultural heritage and landscape underpins natural capital in many instances. That very time depth of human activity sits underneath those natural capital assets that we might want to be describing within the context of natural capital approaches. But cultural heritage assets can also deliver ecosystem services. Every single one of those reports identified that was a thing, that we could say that to greater or lesser degrees. They can also suggest those future and new natural capital assets. The historic landscape characterization work I just referred to suggests that. But there's also an incredible complexity just in our very different definitions of what is cultural and what is natural, which mean that culture and heritage and natural capital are entangled. We have things like the cultural practices that support the ecosystem services, woodland management, landscape management practices, which are needed in order to realise some of those service flows. And we also have the cultural landscapes, which again, there's a whole other lecture on the definitions in place, a whole lot of different contexts. And cultural heritage can flow from natural capital, as we know from the cultural services. And even that understanding of how the ways in which cultural heritage services can flow from natural capital assets is also pretty poorly understood. So it's all pretty complicated. We clearly can't address all of it, but how we can pick those aspects and be really clear about what we can address and what we can't is pretty critical to this project. But and this is why it's important to think about outdoor cultural and heritage capital in this context, because that's where these things really come into play, and we have to start trying to address those. Got a slide summarising some of the key issues. I think I've covered most of this. So that idea of the visibility, invisibility, the physical, visual, virtual, intellectual access. That's something that I think a number of people have already alluded to. There's a really key point, I think, around, this is something that I heard a lot when I was doing the work on natural capital, concern about double counting. And I think we've already discussed this, but that idea of additionality rather than double counting is something that I think we really need to start to explore. So I think generally things are greater than the sum of their parts when it comes to our landscapes, and we know that people respond to those sorts of places very positively. They might not know whether what they're looking at is cultural heritage, is archaeological, or is natural, but they are drawn to and engage with places which are rich in both. There is another sort of cautionary tale, I suppose, about time, both the way in which heritage gains its value from time and its survival over many centuries. It is non-renewable and finite, but it is also constantly created and renegotiated. So the values that we place on heritage are very time specific, culturally specific, and politically determined. And that creates a challenge if you're looking at the ways in which different people might attribute value or benefit from a single place or asset or category of cultural heritage. It is not going to be simple and consistent and maybe contradictory. And that's, I think, going to be quite a big challenge. That idea of potential, those things that we haven't yet discovered, that we don't even know about, we might know that we have huge potential for them. This is something that's very commonly addressed in archaeology. We have ways of using language to describe the importance of that potential and make decisions based on that within our planning systems. But I think trying to bring that thinking into this project might be quite important as we're looking to make changes at scale to landscapes and understand the benefits and the pros and cons of that over time. And just finally, because this is my favourite way to think about that kind of contested or reimagined or differently understood places, Green and Common in Newbury, an incredibly important place for biodiversity, really important place for military history, incredibly important place for its social history and its protest movement, and also my personal favourite, really important for the filming of Star Wars films. So when we're talking about a lot of these assets, they have very different meanings and very different associations and very different benefits to different people, some of which will not be easily compatible. And how we address that and reconcile that. It's not just about reconciling the cultural and the natural, it's also recognising some of those complexities within the cultural. And one person's well-being might be someone else's definite not well-being. Yeah, wanted to try and end on some Star Wars there. Right, sorry, I spoke far too long, but
we're still within time. Okay, so I'm going to cautiously ask for comments and questions, but I do think that we should keep the discussion about value and accounting to the end, partly because Ethan and I are going to bore you to death with it in a second anyway. Okay.
I just thought it was really good. That's great, but I think if we say anything, we won't stop for another hour.
As they open this can of worms.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's my turn, and I will confess to being slightly nervous and apologetic because I've written this as a sort of overview of economics without knowing how much economics people already know and are familiar with. So for some of you, this will be repetition. Yeah, for others, this will be new. So I apologize if you are well versed in this. I'm sorry. But the capitals approach, so everyone who's looked at the DCMS framework and the call for this project was probably familiar with the idea of the capitals approach. It's about trying to assess the portfolio of national assets that underpin well-being, and we can debate what we mean by well-being as part of this process, but what benefits are flowing to people from the productive use of the environment and the economy, natural assets, culture and heritage assets. So I've reproduced here the Desgupta illustration, which includes produced capital, the traditional economists' holy grail, human capital. And if you've ever done a course in economics, you'll know that you start by putting K and L in. That's the labor is your L, and the K is your produced capital, and that's your production function. And we've come a long way in extending that to try and include natural capital and understand the natural environment and the way that that underpins what we produce. But it's going to work. There are also other types of capital that we might want to include. Now, these are contested, right? There's not agreement about how these capitals fit and whether they actually are capitals, because from our different disciplinary perspectives, we define capital in different ways. From a cultural and heritage perspective, I see overlaps with both the natural capital, so the way that landscapes exist has been shaped by our culture and heritage and history. It can't exist separately from it. But also in the produced capital side, right? So we've got buildings, we've got ruins, we've got tea rooms, that form part of that produced capital as well. So we have some overlapping and also some independent existence of these things. And we're motivated by trying to separate this out because we want it to be represented and understood in that decision-making context. The clock in the background should be running, but that's to show you that we're considering this not as a snapshot for today, but over time. And this is where this complexity of values being generated by experiences and evolving over time, and technologies evolving comes in and creates additional complexities in understanding what those assets are worth. And just to put in, this is a quote from the Desgupta review. So economists have taken a sort of reticent and stingy approach to capital, where we tend to think about material, tangible objects as being capital, and we think about them being alienable, so being able to transfer ownership of those assets, which is weird when you think about natural capital, actually. And just for a point for us to discuss later, I cannot think about where a performance sits, whether that should be an asset. And I've seen lots of references in the literature to performances being an asset, but that doesn't make sense to me yet. So I think while there's been a lot of work already done, it's still contestable, and we should be having those discussions ongoing as we come up with taxonomies and ways of thinking to make sure that we agree, or we at least debate, if not agree. So where do we go from this? Well, Harry Saga has this nice diagram. It's the second time we've shown you it, thinking about how this framework is up. So we're thinking about pressures, that's your climate change, your natural crises, thinking about biodiversity crises. You're also thinking about human population growth and dynamics where people are living, use of different assets, productivity, how that's affecting the asset stock, and also how our interventions and the investments that we made are influencing the stock. And then as you come down, we've got three panels. We have the stock of assets themselves. Those produce goods and services, which provide benefits to individuals, and those benefits are what we try to value from that stock across the lifespan of the asset. Now, this diagram for me links back into my understanding of natural capital frameworks, right? So on the left here, we have Saga's diagram. On the right is the Bateman and Mace diagram, looking at the natural capital framework. If you look at A up here, we've got the world and the sun. That's representing the pressures and interventions that are affecting the stock of natural capital assets, right, which is panel B. That stock of assets is producing ecosystem services, and a flow of benefits through economic production to individuals. Right? So I started here, and by looking at the literature that already exists and the taxonomy work that's been done, I thought, okay, well, how about if I just change the Bateman and Mace diagram, try and think about fitting culture and heritage into that framework. So here's my plagiarism of Ian's diagram. So now we can think about this in the same way, right? So we have on the top different capitals. So on the right-hand side, I've now put natural capital as part of the resource supply. So we have natural capital, human and social, and manufacturers capital up in the right-hand corner, and they are interacting with the stock of cultural and heritage capital assets. And sometimes they might be complementary, sometimes there might be elements of substitution, and we shouldn't assume that they're perfectly substitutable, right? I think everyone on this call is going to agree with that. Let's take it from there. I've replaced the world here. So we've got pressures. They might be the same as those pressures that are acting on our natural capital, but there might be additional pressures that we need to take into account. So we still have this driver of change in the top left. We've got a list of tangible assets, and I'm thinking about this from a sort of landscape archaeology perspective here, so to try and make it a bit more tractable. Right, so buildings, archaeological sites, gardens, parks, ruins, and the digital collections are the assets that we have. Those go into a cultural production function and provide cultural services. That itself might also feed into other production services, right? So this is an intermediary role, right? So we have direct impacts on individuals, but also indirect through other production services. And that's called enabling services, I think, in a lot of the literature that we've seen. Then we need to map out, and this is where the blue section is about the taxonomy. It's understanding what are the benefit flows, who are the beneficiaries, what metrics can we use, and how do we tie that into economic value. What I really like about this diagram is that it combines the social cost benefit side, which is adding up those economic values, with the accounting perspective. It thinks about sustainable management of the asset stock itself. So my next slide is going to focus on that taxonomy and values and thinking about where those come from. So one framework that we might go back to try and understand these values is the concept of total economic value. And again, I think I'm preaching to the choir, but I tried to explain this to my husband last night and he was confused. So total economic value is a term that gets used, and what we really mean are all the values that people experience from something, not all the value that something provides, right? The whole of something. I'm not talking about getting rid of culture and heritage capital. What would the total monetary value of that be? I'm talking about if we change the management, what are all different ways in which people are going to be affected? So again, I am taking diagrams that exist and that we are familiar with in natural capital. So this is Uni Pascal et al.'s team diagram for total economic value. I've changed one of the labels. If you're very familiar, they have an actual value label, which I feel is very misleading. So I've turned this into personal values. But they divide total economic value into use values from direct engagement with those assets and non-use values. Okay? And within that, we try and break it down into categories that provide useful ways for us to think about the flows of values, right? I'm not saying this is a definitive known truth. It's a way of classifying values. Okay, so if we start thinking about what these mean, I find it quite easy on the right, or easier on the right, to think about this. So option value is your ability to access those assets in the future for either known benefits or things that would provide you with value, but that you don't currently know about. Quasi-option value is more about uncertainty. So there might be technologies that allow us to access assets that are currently unavailable to us in the future. If those technologies become available, then we have the option. If they don't become available, that asset remains unusable. So that's your option and quasi-option. Now, on the non-use side, we might have philanthropic values, right? So I'm not thinking just about myself in a philanthropic value. I might be thinking about bequesting these assets and the use of the assets and the benefits to my children and future generations. And then on the altruistic side, I might care that other people in my community have access to those benefits, or maybe wider than my community, but not myself. Then we have existence value. This is where we start to get a bit hairy when economists come in, because there's debate whether you can capture this. Does it really, is it really a thing? But you can think of this as value from knowing that culture and heritage exists, even if you never intend to look at it, use it, think about it for any of your own purposes. Right? even if no one else does. So it's separate from future generations and from that altruism. Okay, on the youth side, I found it much harder to think about whether I agree with the placement. So consumptive, so direct use when you're engaging with a site, with an asset, we have consumptive as one of the labels. Now that tends to mean that your use depletes the future availability of something. And you can think about visiting a historic building. You're going to introduce wear and tear. It's going to reduce the lifespan of an asset. So that does create some consumptive element. Recreation and education, well, there's a competitive element to these, because if you go, then you reduce the space for other people to go. So maybe they go in the consumptive side as well. Entertainment, number of shows. What about sense of place? Oh, it depends whether we're putting that competition for access in there. On the non-consumptive, digital engagement, digital assets seem to be more on this side, although you hit the same limits if you have large demand and not so large servers. So again, it depends on the capacity and what kind of assets we're talking about. But hopefully this provides us with a kickoff. Now, there are also other types of value that have been discussed in the literature, and I should say, because Patricia's on here, I really enjoyed reading your article from last year. So there's intrinsic value separate from existence value. Now, this might be, I think the idea here is that this is an intergenerational future perspective on intrinsic value. So existence value would be knowing that it exists now. Intrinsic value in this context would be that it exists in the future for other generations, even though they're not necessarily using it. So it's tricky for me because it starts to become entwined with this bequest value, but it should be separate. And then I really like the label of this, glue value. The idea that these values that are provided are greater than the sum of their parts, right? So that it could be that the assets are greater than the sum of their parts, or that there is complementarity between values such that you get additional value through this. And this might be through the composition of assets, the experience provided by particular compositions in the landscape. Again, I think we can have interesting discussions about whether that glue value is separate or whether it's some sort of functional form element that would come in from an economist perspective. Okay, now I've thrown in a little slide on taxonomy just to remind myself that economists are not, what's that? Right, not the truth holders of value, right? It's not, we need much more of an interdisciplinary perspective to think about what values people derive, cultural studies, sociology, psychology, and economics to understand. And this is one of the classifications that's been provided in the Heritage Science Forum is Brown's dimension. And I like this because it separates out that value can come from engaging with an asset while you're there. It can multiply after you've been somewhere. It can be cumulative over visits and get that experience element. It can be about your individual preferences, but it can also relate to interpersonal relationships, and you might have community values. So values are not just about your own welfare, but about what's happening in terms of engagements between people, the relationships, social capital. So this gives economists a challenge in terms of thinking about how their valuation methods pick up on these different types of value, whether they are fit for purpose. So what are we doing with social cost benefit analysis? And again, you might be very familiar with this, but the idea with social cost benefit analysis is that we provide a systematic tool for identifying and comparing the costs and benefits from different projects or interventions. And we tend to be thinking about marginal changes in the management of an asset or, What do we need in order to be able to do that? Well, we have to set out what the counterfactual is. We have to understand if we didn't have the intervention, what would happen? And to inform that, we need an understanding of heritage science and environmental science at a minimum, right? Because what's the condition of that asset going to be if I don't intervene? It's not going to be the same as just what it is today. We also need to know what are the alternative projects, right? So we're not just thinking about do I or don't I? We're thinking about, okay, I've got a series of options. Which one should I undertake? Right? And there might be multiple ways of achieving different objectives that we're trying to consider. And of course, we need to think about whether we have budget to actually implement these projects in there. We can pass the social cost benefit, but still not be able to buy that thing that we like. Okay, then we need to understand how the intervention or project will influence people's behaviour and what the flow of values from that are. So we need some sort of behavioural model and evaluation system. And that requires having knowledge about individuals and for those individuals to have knowledge themselves about their preferences. We should bear in mind that if we change an asset at one specific site, that does not mean that the behavioural change is limited to that site. We might see substitution in the ways that people engage and where they derive their values from. And then Hannah touched on this. So valuation itself has a lot of considerations in. So we've got to be thinking about what units of measurement and whether or not we're picking up changes in the asset and the value flows in the same way as individuals are. Right? So if as econometricians, we define the units differently to how people actually conceive them, then we introduce measurement error in our analysis. We also have to think about how we bring together values from different sources to avoid double counting, to look at issues of separability and to think about scope, scale and transfer between sites. Right, so this is really back to school. So economists, how do we do this? How do we think about that behavioral change of individuals? And the basic premise that economists bring is that people make choices to make themselves happy and to enhance their welfare. It doesn't mean that it has to be selfish. We can include other people's well-being in what we call utility functions. But the basic thing that we need is that people are able to make choices and that they make those choices with some sense of regularity and order to them, such that we can make predictions about how their behavior will change. So here we have a very nice gentleman who is making a decision about where he's going to spend his weekend, right? And he's got a couple of choices. So those of you from the Southwest might recognise we've got Castle Drogo, Killerton, Manhead Forest and Holden. So he's thinking about the attributes of each of these places, how far they are away, what costs are involved, what he can do when he gets there, what features they have. But he's also got some other choices. So outdoor culture and heritage isn't the only way he can spend his time or derive values, right? He might prefer to stay at home and play computer games, which also provides him with a sense of community and other values, right? He's online, he's working with his friends, he's building up his networks. So there are overlapping value streams that can come from each of these things. So economists assume that people weigh up their different options, which we refer to as a choice set, that they think about the attributes of those choice sets and the flow of benefits that they will receive from them, as well as any costs. And that inherent to the individual are some preferences. And now those preferences themselves might be shaped by the culture and heritage that a person has experienced, right? Those preferences are not, we're not born with a set of preferences and then we live out our lives. They evolve with us through our experiences. Okay, so that underpinning assumption about utility maximization and the preferences of individuals is what underpins valuation methods. Without that set of assumptions, we can't develop these tools. There are two key ways that economists approach valuation. The first is through revealed preference. So we look at the behavior of people in actual markets that are indirectly linked to the assets that we are interested in. Now, that immediately brings in a problem because we're looking at people who are engaging with a market, which may restrict us to looking at use values or at least values that are associated with the use of something else. The two key methods that come up here are travel cost methods, where we look at people's behavior in terms of moving from their home to visit a specific site and thinking about the costs involved in that being representative of at least the minimum value they must get, right? So underpinning utility, if they spend that much, it must be worth at least that. The second is hedonic analysis, which is using engagement in the property market to look at where people decide to locate in relation to the different sites and attributes that are available to them. So when I bought my house, consideration of the parks was pretty paramount. I have two young children and I wanted to be close to very good parks. So yeah. Anyway, I do a lot of work in properties. I'm invested in the idea that property market can tell you something, if not everything. Okay, so that's revealed preference. Now, stated preference. Let me bring one in. Let's stick with revealed preference for a second. Now, there are definite limitations with these methods, right? Immediately, you have an information asymmetry. If you can't talk to the person who was making this choice, then you have to make a lot of assumptions about what choice sets they were considering, what attributes they paid attention to, how they measured those attributes, whether they were thinking about their private benefits or their societal benefits, whether they had full knowledge or whether there was uncertainty over how things would evolve. And these all lead into like assumptions that go into your analysis that may affect the results and sensitivity. Stated preference allows you to access non-use values. So we're thinking about survey methods and deliberative methods, choice experiments, where you present a hypothetical market. Right? So people don't have to be actually engaging in a market. You can present them with some scenarios. This also has problems, although there's been work recently looking at how you can minimize the biases that might be present with these methods. So the fact that it's a hypothetical market, right, introduces bias by itself. We can control attributes artificially in ways that might not represent the way that assets are distributed over space, which can cause problems in terms of how feasible people think your scenario is. But also, you might not observe what people think about in addition to the attributes you've presented to them, right? So you can say, I'm controlling these things. They might assume in the background that other things would change, would have to change because of their experiences of the world. There are other issues such as scope sensitivity. So if I ask you how much you are willing to pay for the restoration of one building, does that double for another building? And there are ways to test sensitivity to scope in these experiments. But the question is less about whether you can test it and more about whether people actually exhibit sensitivity to scope in their preferences. Or is it more of a warm glow? I like to donate to restoration, but I'm not going to pay you more if it's more than my building. There's a whole huge literature on different things in CV that I think inspired me to come into environmental economics in the first place. Thank you, Mr. Bateman. So the order in which you present choices to people can affect the way that they respond. The numbers that you put in terms of gains or change can anchor them, as well as any numbers associated with payments. And the mechanism through which you describe them making contributions, taxes, can cause a response as well. So there's a lot to think about in terms of the transferability and the sensitivity of these, but we try and get around that with testing, triangulation, and thinking about benefit transfer. Right, I'm on to my last slide, I'm probably over time.
Yep.
So just to say, non-use values, they can be held by people who use assets as well as people who do not use assets, and we need clever and thoughtful design to try and separate those two. We can't use indirect markets for non-user values. There are multiple categories of non-use by itself. So we talked about bequest, we talked about altruism, existence, intrinsic, and how and do we need to separate those. There's good progress on sensitivity and testing, but the challenge for us is to provide robust and conservative values that can be fed into the Green Book and used across sites. Right. Which leads on to
Cool. I think we'll just go straight through because I think a lot of what Amy and I are going to talk about are related. I thought I would start. So this is going to be as well a high level overview of kind of the role of national accounts and thinking about what this means for sustainable management of culture and heritage capital. To begin with, I just thought it would be good to talk about what environmental economics is and this weird thing that we have to do to disentangle and differentiate the environment from the economy, because that's what Amy and I and Ian and others do. So I would say that environmental economics is thinking about relationships between the environment and the economy from the environment impacting the economy. So for example, there are really cool research about how the reintroduction of wolves to an area reduces the frequency of car crashes because they scare deer from being out in open areas. On the other hand, we can look at how changes to the economy might impact the environment. So if we change agricultural policy, how might that change nutrient flows in nearby watersheds, for example? But this is a really unsatisfying definition of what we do as environmental economists, in part because I think about the environment as part of the economy. The economy is, I would define as the producers, consumers, intermediaries of goods and services. And for sure, the environment is a source or producer of goods and services. That's what we study. And it also serves as a key intermediary, transporting and distributing resources, and that kind of changes the value of goods and services as well by manipulating them over space. And I think one of the key things that differentiates environmental goods and services is the really close relation to space. And I think that's why there's a nice overlap between the way that we might think about cultural and heritage assets and natural assets. You can't just take a tree and throw it up 30,000 feet above the air someplace over the earth and have it provide the same set of services or indeed have the same value. So why does environmental economics try to distinguish the environment from the rest of the economy? One answer might be because the environment is special in some way. So we've seen precipitous declines in resource abundance, environmental quality, and biodiversity, and this might merit special attention and kind of why a lot of us spend time thinking about these. Similar concerns of scarcity is really what fueled, I think, the idea of national accounting. So at the dawn of the Great Depression in the 1920s, we really did not have national accounts. And with the development of questions about war, how do we pay for war? How do we feed people? What do we do about inflation? How can we prevent another depression from happening? And how can we bring kind of the things that make successful businesses successful to the operation of the national economy? These types of things led to a tandem development of macroeconomics as a field and the idea of national accounting. Then kind of over time in the 1970s, there's an excellent paper by Bill Nordhaus and James Tobin called Is Growth Obsolete?, where they think about things like technology and population change instead of as single events that perturb the system in equilibrium to processes that actually govern the way that this broader economy, this broader way of producing benefits for people and well-being changes. Now, and kind of since I would say the 1990s, but maybe earlier, we're concerned about a different type of scarcity and a different type of question, which is the ever abundant resources like clean air and clean water species that we use are becoming limited. And as a result, we're concerned about the environment and sustainability. And national accounts help us kind of keep track of these things together. So accounts, for those of you who haven't worked on them, have three key components. And in the UK, this is from ONS, the national accounts are an integrated description of economic activity within the UK that's comprehensive, fully integrated, and internally consistent. And the three components are production accounts, and this is really what we think about if you hear about headline indicators of the economy. We're thinking about the value of inputs that you put into this machine. It creates output, and then you have the value of outputs. And the difference between them, although not in that order, is gross value added. So the value of the outputs, which should be greater than the value of the inputs, gives you the gross value added to the economy. And that's pretty much what GDP is. So GDP is just an adjustment on gross value added for taxes and subsidies. And so when we hear about GDP being increasing or at a certain level as this headline indicator of the health of the economy that so much policy is based on, that really is just a flow measure of how much we have added to things that we have used. The second component are income accounts, which come close to measuring the same thing. Again, a flow measure, which says, here are the income, here's the wages that we paid to people, the income that individuals have, minus the expenditure, how much they've spent on goods and services, and the difference between that are savings. And the third piece, which I think is the most important, is now coming to a stock measure, which is a balance sheet. Assets minus liabilities, giving us some kind of net worth or this net value of assets that we have. And if we do this balance sheet exercise of looking at a stock of assets over time repeatedly, we can take the difference between them and get a really important flow that doesn't require us to kind of go and measure all of the things in the production income accounts, which is kind of this net investment or this savings net of depreciation. I think one of the main things to think about, though, especially in applying this kind of accounting framework to the question of culture and heritage capital for outdoor heritage and outdoor culture and heritage is the production boundary. So this is the description of what is actually included in national accounts today. Rather, what should be included in national accounts today. So many things don't get included because they're difficult. So the production boundary are things included in the production boundary in the accounts are goods and services that have to be produced by a thing, a unit, that either owns or is entitled to be compensated for its production. And this leaves some really perplexing things that get included or not included in the accounts. In one sense, there are human-mediated environmental activities, so aquaculture and managed rotational forestry, that get included in things like GDP and balance sheets, or at least should be. We don't often do a great job of including all of the things that matter in this respect, but for the most part, aquaculture will appear in national accounts. On the other hand, if we just, and the picture in the background, if we just didn't enclose the fish in the ocean, those same fish would now not be included, and the fish that they produce would not be included in the national accounts. Because there's no human involvement, open ocean kind of fish stock growth isn't tracked under the system of national accounts that kind of governs the way we do this. Other things to mention, so interestingly, like illegal activity, black market activity should be and sometimes are included in national accounts, but things that are really important for the cultural heritage sector, so volunteer work, leisure time, quality of health and education, distribution of income, these things aren't included in the system of national accounts. And so for our kind of objective in this, one of the work packages for the bid, for the project, I think we're interested in answering some questions about applying a system of national accounts like process to thinking about culture and heritage. And in other places, we're thinking about lofty ideas of how to manage culture and heritage sustainably in a much more open way. How do we think about valuing volunteer hours or the quality of health and leisure time and all these experiences that by the letter of the law aren't to be included in national accounts, at least in a comparable way in accordance with the system of national accounts today. And Ian can probably correct me if I've said anything wrong, and I'll acknowledge that Ian's been involved in a lot of coming up with the ways that we think about this for natural capital, but we should try to disentangle what is going to be useful for the project and for these case studies and what actually does get put in to national accounts and for pilot accounts for local areas in the way that we might want to implement that. One answer to that is if there are issues that we can't include some things into national accounts, we might want to create satellite accounts. And so the UK has done this really well and has 3 key satellite accounts to name. One of them is environmental accounts. The second are tourism accounts to keep track of special sectors that we might want to pull out or disentangle from measures that might already capture their value. But we might want to keep that aside just to understand the relevance or significance of that piece. The third are household accounts, which try to come up with the value of household produced services. So if you pay someone to come and take care of your children and clean your house, that is included in the national accounts. But if you do those services and don't get compensated, even though the same thing happened, because there wasn't a transaction, we're not going to pick that up in the national accounts. And so these types of things are important, and countries have recognized this and included it as a set of satellite accounts. So now how do we get to sustainability? Like if we want to manage these things and if we want to help enable better decision-making and better policies, what do we need from this set of tools that are provided by a system of accounts? Well, production accounts, we already said, kind of don't do a good job. So for one, they don't account for the depreciation of capital well. They definitely don't include for the depreciation of natural capital. It's not going to pick up anything outside of the production boundary, and it's only a flow measure. And so the analogy that I really like that I've heard Bill Clark use is that if we only have information about kind of GDP or these production accounts, we'll know how fast we're going, but we'll have no idea how much fuel is left in the tank. And if you're thinking about flying the sustainability airplane, right, you want to know how fast you're flying, which might be a good thing, you get to your goal faster, but also how far you're going to be able to get and how much fuel you have in the tank so that you stay in the air and can land. So positive or increasing GDP is not a sufficient sustainability criteria. Similarly, income accounts are a flow measure again and not sufficient. So we need stock measures, and stock measures help us because we can create this kind of one-shot look at all of the assets we have. It gives us how much fuel is in the tank, and if we can measure the amount of fuel in the tank over different time periods in a consistent way, we can figure out exactly how much has changed in a way that we capture a flow that's helpful. So we know the flow and the stock. And what's important, I think, for this project is that we don't just generate a one-off study for a pilot project, but that we come up with a replicable pipeline for generating these balance sheets and applying these taxonomies of culture and heritage capital, so that we can do this over and over again and produce estimates, comparably to the way that they're produced for statistics on other aspects of the economy. So quarterly measures of how we're maintaining, or annual measures of how we're maintaining our assets. And I think that's really important. At the end of the day, I think we're going to try to do three things. We're either going to have to measure new things, measure old things better, or attribute and disentangle existing measures to think about kind of answering these management questions. Last couple things to say. We can choose to assemble these accounts as physical accounts and or monetary accounts. And typically we need market prices to develop these accounts. National accounts appear in monetary units, pounds, dollars, yen. However, these physical accounts are still useful, and in fact are really useful and have been applied really usefully in natural capital. So these would track the quantity, extent, and condition of the assets, comporting with something like a strong sustainability criterion. Does it matter how many stones make up a stone circle, how much each of the stones in a stone circle is worth, if we can just ensure that the number of stones that we have in each position stay the same over time, right? That would be a strong sustainability criterion. What we have is exactly the same as it is in the future. And so we can take these physical accounts, and if we find this Rosetta Stone that allows us to eventually convert physical accounts to monetary accounts, we can go back and use these non-market valuation tools that Amy mentioned to come up with the exchange or shadow value that gives us a monetary account so that we can compare apples to apples. One of the problems and things that we'll have to answer for the case studies is what the units of these physical accounts are, and not just what units are feasible, but what units are helpful for management. And so these come from these next two figures just basically repeat the same information, but I'm just signposting some of the figures that came out of the Bakshi Coyle et al. Paper that was part of the ESCOE call and related to some of the culture and heritage documents that are available on this program. There's some information about how we think about intangibles, which I'm sure we'll have a rich discussion about later. For the purposes of time, again, just reiterating that we have these assets. We can come up with these physical accounts that measure maybe the units. What are capital assets, right? These are things that enable future consumption. And so when we think about translating physical accounts to monetary accounts, the stock values might have to come from an examination of the flows of services that we then have to value. So the value of the asset in the account might need to come from the application of a good taxonomy of the services that asset provides, and an understanding of kind of a lot of normative decisions about how those services should be valued through time as they aggregate to different people inter and intra-generationally. So exactly what I think Anushka mentioned before, who are the people who count and how should they count in terms of the values that accrue to them today? Is it just middle-class people? How far away from the site do these values accrue? And then across time, how should these values count across individuals? And though this is something that appears like an objective exercise, these pieces are very normative and very subjective. Why are the numbers useful, even if there are these baked in normative assumptions? Because, to kind of paraphrase Peter Drucker, what gets measured gets managed. And so if we have these measurements, we might be able to do a better job of managing them and observing change that we want to keep track of. I'll skip discounting because I talked a little bit about changing values over time and thinking a little bit about the time that I'm running out of here, and just say that for physical accounts, the taxonomy is crucial. Satellite accounts can help us avoid double counting. Monetary accounts can be difficult because we'd have to put a pound value on things that are irreplaceable or non-tradable. And these things might be fungible over a stable physical account if tastes, technology change, or if there are non-linearities like tipping points. Finally, we might want to think about how we account for unmeasured pieces or disentangling from aggregates which are kind of one of the three things I mentioned earlier. So we're going to need to pilot process development and measurement. Once we come up with that, choosing these normative criteria, figuring out what the goal or objective should be, and then I think importantly, thinking about the production process of these values that we mentioned. When are natural capital and cultural heritage capital net substitutes or net complements? Do they work together to provide more value for users? So if we invest in natural capital, does that make the culture and heritage capital at a site more or less valuable, and vice versa? So that's what I have. Apologies for the rush, but happy to engage in a broader discussion, and I hope that was useful.
Yes, so we can take immediate questions on these, and then we are going to reconvene at 1:15 as well, or just discussion, no more presentations, just open floor time for us to talk. So yeah, Patricia, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I'm not an expert at all in accounting, but this is something that we have been discussing in the previous project, definition of stock and flows for cultural assets. If we go back to the definition by David Trosby of what is cultural capital in economic terms, as I said, that comes from the definition of natural capital, we distinguish between stock and flows. So don't you say, as many have said, I have a provocation here, because from the definition I have a stock like a cathedral, and that stock can be valued independently. It's terrible for you to hear that, from its flows, because I have one flow that is tourism of that capital, of that asset, that services brought by tourists can be valued independently, especially if we look at the individual. Obviously, individual perception of value and so on. So this is a dramatic difference. In a sense, it's because we look at probably a T, a time. So it's like a snapshot. So I can value now the stock, and I can value the flows. Risk overlapping, I don't know, maybe double counting, but it's by definition that I would move, and I insisted, in a sense, in some discussion, to move towards that direction. Another thing that Amy was mentioning before, discussing about all the values, which I think is still very important to discuss about total economic value and what is not total economic value, which is, for instance, intrinsic. The intrinsic value is a bit, a bit a question mark. In cultural heritage, intrinsic value maybe defines the value of heritage because it's strictly linked to cultural values. If I don't have cultural values, I don't have cultural heritage. So it's this intrinsic value that might not be captured that defines the asset as a cultural asset. So intrinsic value, I can say, I can glue value the definition I gave, but it's the definition itself that might bring me to double counting. It's a long discussion. We cannot, but first of all, the two things are linked. In the accounting, I can say, okay, I'll separate the value of the asset. I can estimate the total economic value of the cathedral separate from the value and the benefits that services like tourist services for the cathedral bring. So back to you.
I think that's maybe a topic for a little bit longer discussion after the break. I'd say that maybe this relates more to coming up with comparable measures that comport with the system of national accounts versus coming up with more pluralistic measures and more holistic measures of value and flow. Strictly speaking, and Ian can come in if I've gotten any of this wrong, but I would consider capital as a savings account of future flows, plus maybe a scrappage or continuation value. And so I would argue that there is not a difference between the sum of the flows into the future weighted to today and the value of the stock. But we can have that discussion a little bit later.
In the interest of having time to eat a sandwich, I think we will have our break now and reconvene at 1:15. Yep. See you all here in about just over half an hour.
Shall I end the call? Yeah, so I'm going to, I think, leave the call here, and then I will reopen the call once we finished our lunch so that you don't have to look at views of us with bits of bread and mayonnaise and munching noises.
By the way, Ethan, I totally agree with your definition.
I was caught a little bit off guard with the scrappage value thing, which is you might have to consider this lump sum thing for future generations that has nothing to do with flows, because we just haven't come up with a way to allocate the flows to individuals today.
Yeah. You know, it also might be worth mentioning, you know, it's really difficult to bring in issues like technical change into capital accounts, you know. But that applies to GDP as well. You know,
forget about technical change, just preference change.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, absolutely.
Keep technology the same.
No, I know people say to me things like, but the values might change over time. And I'm like, well, if they don't, I'll be really worried.
There